Kia ora, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are located in the world. My name is Kerstin Rupp, and I work for Jacobs in New Zealand. I welcome you all to the Modelling World International session of Climate Change Challenges for Transport Models. We will hear from 3 speakers, and they will share with us their thoughts and insights into what we are doing in this field and how well or not so well we are doing presently. But firstly, I would like to open the session with a karakia. Darren Fidler, one of our speakers, has kindly offered to present an opening and a closing karakia for us. Darren, if you please could come on and give us the karakia.
Kia ora koutou. So a karakia is basically a way to open and close a session. It's part of Maori culture and something which I think is a fantastic way to both open this session and then we'll close one at the end. It is not my first language, so apologies for any Te Reo Maori speakers in the audience and my pronunciation. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mākinakina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai, ehi ake ana te atakura, he teo, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, mauri ora. Kia ora.
Thank you, Darren. Ka pai. As mentioned before, we have 3 speakers and they will present in the following order. Firstly, Phil Goodwin, Emeritus Professor of Transport Policy at UCL and UWE, and he's located in the UK. The next presenter is Darren Fidler, Principal Transport Advisor at the Christchurch City Council, and he's located in New Zealand. And thirdly, Smit, Director, Transport Energy Emissions Research, and he's located in Australia. Due to the time zone, with Phil being located in the UK, he has pre-recorded his session, but he is amazingly joining us for the Q&A session at the end. So please don't forget to post your questions on the right-hand side in the conference room on the 3rd tab, which is called Q&A. Please do that while the presentations are still going. And if we could please start Phil's recording now, that'd be appreciated. Thank you.
So my theme is modelling without business as usual. I'm mainly going to focus on the big models, the ones that are used to forecast future movement and support big projects. Their common philosophical starting point is that the future will be sufficiently like the past, that relationships observed or thought to be observed in the past will continue to be stable enough to use as a guide to the future, reliable enough to support decisions, maybe with a few modest caveats, but no serious doubt about the conclusions. COVID-19 and climate change both challenge the credibility of that view. But actually, I want to start with a small example from a different break in continuity, Brexit. As far as I know, there was not and still has not been a single model test to model the effects of Brexit on the previously modelled traffic forecasts for the current multi-billion-pound programme of road projects. Well, it's early days, but within the first couple of months, we already saw one effect: a new pattern of freight movement from Ireland to the rest of Europe. Dozens of new ferry routes shipping containers or freight lorries between Ireland and the rest of Europe. There are obvious implications on English ports and east-west roads across England. Now, the point of this example is that it is exactly the sort of thing that big conventional models are able to deal with: a shift in the well-established pattern of movement from a well-defined set of origins to a well-defined set of destinations due to a change in the relative cost of different routes. A decent model would have been able to give quite a good prediction of a future different from the past and something like that slide. But nobody wanted to know. That's not a failing of the models, of course. I suppose it's a failure of imagination or courage in the way they were used. Now, let's think about COVID-19. What lessons are there? The fact of the pandemic was so predictable that years ahead, many countries undertook detailed simulation studies, war games in a sense, about what to do. And there was one important feature of the way the pandemic grew that was also predictable. It followed aviation routes. Epidemics become pandemic by international travel, which happens in timescales of hours or days. Vaccines can be produced far quicker now, but still in timescales of months at best. Therefore, future viruses will surely trigger much more immediate control of international travel, and that must be part of the future scenario for aviation. That is completely a transport issue, and surely modelling has something to contribute to it. Serious interruptions in travel, in effect, will become part of the definition of business as usual, rather than uninterrupted growth. As far as I know, there were no uses of transport models to address the effects of the type of constraints on movement that would necessarily be involved. Maybe I'm wrong on that, and it was done, but we never heard about it. Or maybe some people here now were involved in such an exercise. Maybe. But I think it was not done, because it would have seemed a waste of time to ask models to forecast effects of something that was so different from the conditions during which they were built up. That's true, though it would have been very informative to find out how good or bad their predictions would have been. Anyway, it happened, uninformed by modelling, and we learned how swiftly and in how many dimensions travel behaviour could and did adjust. Is that a completely original finding? Well, no, it's not. There had already been many examples of disasters which have affected travel patterns very substantially and very swiftly. Volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, bridge collapses. We've also had decades of experience of implementing policies and transport provisions which, for example, give positive feedback to trends, embedding car-dependent lifestyles, or seeking to reverse that positive feedback, for example, in the pedestrianisation of town centres. We already observed this. So why does it seem surprising that the boundaries of human and political response to crisis or to positive feedbacks in policy are quite different from those which appear when we imagine we're in a steady state, or more precisely, a steady autonomous growth? Mainstream modelling frameworks have not been built around the understandings from that experience, but this was a choice. The observations were there to be seen, but the choice was that this is not the proper business of models. Business as usual is also the casualty of what we know about climate change. I don't want to talk about climate change modelling itself, except to say that it offers us two crucial scenarios which affect the future of all travel. And neither of these scenarios are taken seriously in transport modelling. The first scenario we completely ignore in mainstream transport modelling is the implications of failure. Suppose we fail to change the production of CO2 and other atmospheric drivers sufficiently to halt warming. We're advised by the climate models that this will mean, among other effects, a rise in sea levels drastically affecting populations. And we're also advised by climate models that it implies the conversion of many currently hot locations into unlivable ones. Now, taken together, those two effects have results for some of the wealthiest, most pleasant, and most desirable locations in the coastal cities of the world, and also some of the poorest and most difficult situations. Both would mean mass population movements, maybe in the order of 1 billion migrants in their own lifetimes, including some of us. It's inconceivable that current patterns of international movement and national movement in countries whose geography stretches across equatorial and temperate and cold regions could then continue or recover steady growth along past trends. If that is the future, the idea of present infrastructure and transport management policies being usefully informed by business as usual traffic, that is utter nonsense. If planning is useful to cope with that scenario, it will be about flexible and resilient transport and living arrangements, not fixed infrastructure. The engineering model will not be the norms of civil engineering we've inherited, but its predecessor, military engineering, temporary camps, pontoon bridges, managing huge population movements, traffic movements under huge pressure. There could be an important role for contingency modelling to plan for that, though I do understand the concern that modelling it might seem to be preparing people to accept it. I can understand that. What I cannot understand is how we also fail to carry out serious modelling of the other scenario, success. What happens to transport if we are able to reduce carbon output sufficiently to avoid that calamity, forced evacuations, migrations, and the rest? Now, I'd ask you to agree that the most likely condition for such a success would include rapid progress in reducing the volume and distance of travel substantially, completely, obviously, by fossil fuel vehicles, but also the total amount of travel, including electric vehicles, whether cars or planes, and therefore also the carbon emissions from manufacture of the vehicles and construction of the infrastructures. Now, I know there are some who say this is not necessary and electrification will enable business as usual growth. I'd assert that it is already clear that that trajectory is insufficient and unrealistic. And many governments also assert the same thing. It's commonplace in official statements that we must use our cars less. We must favour walking and cycling and buses and metro systems. We must replace short distance flights by better trains. This is no longer a minority or crank idea. It is the very widespread received official wisdom in policy statements anyway. So why is there such resistance to making the success scenario the central case for project appraisal and the agenda for systematic, appropriate modelling of exactly what projects and what policies would most swiftly bring this success about? Because there's a problem. It's not at all clear that models whose history is the assessment of projects to provide infrastructure for permanent growth, are capable of providing good answers to that question. Now, the first reason for that is obvious. A model that only includes vehicle travel cannot say anything useful about sustainable transport policies. That's surely self-evident in towns, but I'd say it affects the strategic network also. This is because any behavioural model has to allow for destination choice, not only mode choice, and certainly not only route choice. Now, surely one of the most robust findings from half a century of modelling is that if costs increase over the whole network, redistribution will shorten average journey distances, and vice versa if costs reduce. What that means is that the mechanisms of changing mode choice interact with those of destination choice. Policies which make local movement easier and more attractive by local public transport, walking, cycling, and indeed by land use planning must also affect the amount of long distance travel. We cannot implicitly assume that the journey length distribution is a stable modelling parameter, or we would substantially underestimate the potential. We'd get an answer, but it would be wrong. So if we do want to use models to help define and assess policies for success, the questions that arise are, will they be the same models, and will they be used under the same institutional arrangements? Let's deal with that latter point first. The modelling industry, that's us, is an ecosystem of social relationships between clients and contractors and vested interests and users. The main clients, public or private, are often the main funder and promoter of specific projects. The modeller's own business plan needs contracts for the sort of model they are good at. All these parties are codependent, sometimes complicit. When things go wrong, like the Australian experience of modelled forecasts of toll revenues, which led to some banks losing money, there is a row about whose fault it was. But mostly the errors are not apparent until years or decades later, and by then there is no one accepting responsibility, or for that matter, accepting that error existed. Models are complex, they're very rarely transparent, they're almost never fully open access. They are run by a sort of priesthood, that's us, with lengthy training and their own language. In those circumstances, the roles of scrutiny and challenge are supremely important. What we're now seeing is that model-based assessments are under challenge in circumstances outside professional conferences and official reports. I'm involved in one at the moment as an expert witness in our High Court, suggesting that official figures underestimate the carbon consequences of road projects. The action was initiated by a quite small campaigning group, crowdfunded, and recently reported in a British newspaper, which in turn led to an intervention, among others, from Greta Thunberg. These are not contexts that most of us are familiar with. In my experience, the main active challenge often comes from political groups who are out of power and environmental campaigning groups who are well informed but poor. Statutory restrictions and procedures do not always make scrutiny easy. So how to promote healthy scrutiny and challenge? Does it require independent arbitration? separation of client and promoter, open access to the models themselves, statutory funding for challenge. Could we have a consulting industry of skilled modelers who would be prepared both to provide the models and to critique them? Is there a market niche for professional modelers to make a living from representing the challengers? Would you want to? Would you dare? My own position is that there are some inbuilt features of the best established models which tend to underestimate the dimensions and speed of behavioural change when needed, and therefore contribute less than helpfully to sustainability. The modelling concepts of equilibrium and steady, uninterrupted long-term growth do not cope with asymmetrical relationships, for example, with price or income, or cohort effects of ageing. We do not have an approach to transport pricing which copes with an electricity market which might be paid for at different frequencies, different units, changing prices from minute to minute, offering opportunities for hedging and buying in advance, or smart charging in two directions. We have not taken seriously the crucial importance of timing and the speed of change and the sequence of policy interventions. In a sentence, I think that now and for the rest of our lives, we will live in a disequilibrium world. Chaos is always close, and business as usual is an illusion. There is no usual. Therefore, I'd say we need dynamically specified models which can accommodate imperfectly reversible relationships, discontinuity, and path dependence, and give outputs of an evolving, uncertain pattern in explicit time, not an equilibrium one. So in conclusion, what I'm saying is there is a role for models and there's a role for modelers, many roles, but it's not the same as it has been, and it needs to be earned.
Fantastic. Just a quick reminder to please put your questions into the conference room Q&A tab. So I haven't seen anything come through yet. So please put some in, otherwise everyone will have to live with my questions. So Darren, if you could please come up.
Is that all working okay?
Yes, it is.
Cool. Kia ora koutou. So my talk today, just got to be a little bit careful about copyrights and Al Gore. So I got the thesaurus out, and I think we'll all agree that modelling is predicated on many, many awkward assumptions. So I'm just going to delve into a few of those just now. So if I can just get my screen up. Going to run through some intended consequences of investment that modelling used to support, how models have been used to underpin that investment, a little bit about unintended consequences and what's changing. And then I guess the purpose of this session is to get onto greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm going to start off with some words of wisdom from the first time that I became aware of what the impact of investment was. On a family holiday many, many decades ago, we were stuck in traffic on the M25 in London. And my dad said, I wish they'd just widen this to get rid of this congestion. And you can see the headline there from a newspaper article a little bit later when they were still widening the M25 is more lanes are needed to unblock the M25. When my dad said this, my brother said, well, won't that just mean that more people will drive? Kind of inspirational wisdom from a 10-year-old older brother. Just gonna flick over now to Justin, who hopefully is going to be able to show you a video.
By ingesting the 12 months worth of data you sent. That's about 2 terabytes worth.
Wow.
What you're looking at now is a typical midweek traffic flow.
Green is good, orange indicates slower than average, red is heavy.
Now we can manually input a range of external factors: wet weather, public holidays, RDOs for the industrial sector.
Breakdown on a major arterial.
That's pretty impressive.
So we've taken your project.
The road upgrade, extra lanes, on and off ramp lengthening.
We factored in all those improvements. So starting with current flow during peak, then during construction, some problems.
Of course.
And then when it opens, oh, that's brilliant.
Amazing.
And with the machine learning, we can keep it going. Year 2, year 3, year 4.
Wait, what's going on?
What happened?
Where'd the green go? What happened? Why does the traffic get worse?
Have you heard of the Jevons paradox?
I'm hoping they're a death metal band.
It basically states that the better you make something like a road, the more people will use it.
Isn't that a good thing?
No, it means you spend a lot of money now for a very short-term benefit.
So there is some benefit.
Oh, sure. Average travel times crossing the city will be cut by 2.5 minutes or a little less.
Call it 2.
Really?
And that lasts for 14, 15 months.
Then declines.
No, stays flat.
Then declines.
Well, for $300 billion, I guess we were hoping for something a little more dramatic.
2.5 minutes.
Call it 2.
You don't look happy.
Okay, if I just go back into my presentation. Okay, I can't leave with a quote from my brother because his ego's as big enough as it is, but obviously if a 10-year-old kid gets it, if Australian comedy writers get it, and maybe there's something in this. So just a quote here from John Maynard Keynes, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. Very interesting guy if you want to have a read up on interesting people. He was one of the few people, or very rich people, that was very rich before the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, and was very rich afterwards as well. And he put that down to not being super smart or anything different. It's just he changed his plan. And I think this sums up that we've got the tools. We know we need to change, but we're still hanging on to the old way of doing things. So what do we need to do differently? This is a graph from Christchurch, from our transport modelling we do here with Ministry of Transport forecasts about EV uptake. So just looking at what are the blue triangles there, are what our emissions with the current land use assumptions, current mode share, etc., the 4-step model we have, and the current EV uptake estimations. You can see the blue triangle over the next 30 years. Emissions are forecast to reduce significantly, which is great news, given that transport emissions or road transport emissions make up about 1/3 of Christchurch's. The not so good news is that we have local, national and international targets of 50% reduction over the next 10 years and then neutral over the next 30 years, which are those orange bars. So things are certainly getting better, but they're by no means getting better fast enough. A lot of this isn't a surprise. As Phil talked about, we've invested in a certain way to achieve certain outcomes, and we've certainly got a lot of opportunities for people to travel further, more quickly, which has opened up a huge amount of access. Unfortunately, from an emissions perspective, that has been predominantly road-based over the last few decades. This isn't unique to Christchurch. Some recent press from Auckland, where their transport plan, whilst it has a huge amount of good stuff happening there with regards to carbon reduction, because of the significant population growth forecast in Auckland, they're being scrutinised that we've got the same 50% reduction targets and they're showing an increase over that 10-year period. So we need to start doing stuff differently. So what do we use transport models for at the moment? Well, historically, a lot of it has come down to travel time savings, benefit cost ratios, getting people where they want to go quicker. That's obviously been changing in more recent years, a far more multimodal approach, and it's not just about travel time savings, it's about providing capacity for the appropriate modes, which ultimately comes back to providing access both for people and goods to opportunities. So we've got the tools in order to be able to measure access. So what's going wrong? A lot of our transport models, or most of our transport models, will focus around within the model, whichever step of the process it is around generation, distribution, mode choice and assignment. It's focused around those generalized costs around travel time, vehicle operating costs, fares, parking, etc. And very little about access, which is actually what we're trying to enable. Those savings in travel times, and whilst we have a dollar value for them or a pound value for them, the key thing we're trying to provide is people with access to opportunities. Whilst we can measure these as outputs from transport models, all of these external costs listed there around emissions, and that's around greenhouse gas emissions, but we've also got broader pollutants, congestion we measure very well, safety impacts, amenity, urban form, and productivity. Those are all things which we can measure for the appraisal of different investments, but they're not something which typically influence how people are travelling within the model, and that's because they're not influencing how people choose to travel in reality, which comes back down to those user costs on the left-hand side. So just because I like quotes, and another interesting character, Oscar Wilde, I'm sure most of you have heard this quote before, because we need to think about trade-offs we're making, comes back to, I guess, the field of economics. We need to know the value of things so that people can make trade-offs, because unfortunately we can't have everything we want. There's just not enough resource to do that. There are some win-win situations, but not many. So we're all familiar with the concept of trade-offs, and one example which came to the fore in New Zealand over recent years, and understand around the rest of the world as well, is with regards to road safety. And with many countries, including New Zealand, have a vision zero or target zero of zero deaths and serious injuries on the road. And you get people saying, well, or members of the public, you can't put a value on human life. We should do this at all costs, which most of us that use transport models and do safety assessments once in a while, you can put a value on human life, and we've been doing it for decades. Currently, it's around about $5 million. And if it costs more than that to save that life, then in the cold, harsh reality of constrained funds and trade-offs is we don't do it. And that includes if it takes people longer to get somewhere, because that's something which we put a dollar value on as well. So we could get to vision zero quicker by placing a higher cost on human life, so that when we make these trade-offs, there's more emphasis placed on those deaths and serious injuries. An alternate approach is one that's been taken in New Zealand, is with regards to if it's a safety project with a specific purpose of saving lives and reducing serious injuries, then you can start to discount any of the negative impacts with regards to travel time or vehicle operating cost, and just focus on the outcome you want. We could equally get to the same place by just increasing the value of a human life. So could we do the same thing with CO2 emissions? I don't know if it's the same with the economic appraisal around the rest of the world, but the value of carbon at the moment is very low, which means when we get to doing the economic appraisal, multi-criteria analysis, etc., for carbon emissions, the impact on emissions is typically a very, very small component of the total economic cost or benefit of a scheme. So again, is this something which we could get around by just increasing the cost of carbon? And the Climate Change Commission in New Zealand have given some draft advice to government which suggests exactly that, and has prices of carbon orders of magnitude higher than we currently have as what's required in order to encourage that behaviour change and result in that fundamental shift that's needed. So obviously, we've always got a do nothing or a do minimum, and if reducing CO2, reducing global warming, and all of the adverse impacts, many of which Phil talked about, if that's not enough, then well, why don't we just buy carbon credits? Let's plant our way out of this. Doing some back of the envelope calculations, certainly for Christchurch, and I suspect it would be very, very similar for other cities around New Zealand and the world, is, yep, we could certainly do that, but we would be more than doubling our operational expenditure in Christchurch, which that would have a direct impact on ratepayers. So we could go business as usual with the same level of emissions as we're currently forecasting, and then just buy the carbon credits, get a way out of that. But that's going to have a massive impact on the ratepayer, the taxpayer. So it might be better then to actually change our emissions profiles from transport itself. So given that we now know a whole load more about the impacts on whether it's safety or emissions and the significant costs it had, we're doing modelling and analysis and project appraisal, investment appraisal in a slightly different context. So John Maynard Keynes, the reason he survived the stock crash in 29 was because the facts changed, and he changed his mind. A very smart guy, so died very wealthy. So what are we doing about that in Christchurch? So we've had some great political statements, both at a national, regional and local level, with climate change emergencies declared, targets put in place, which is great. So, well, okay, now we've got these targets, how are we going to meet them? That's the challenge. And what we've done is create a dashboard where we understand what the emissions are from the transport system, and they essentially come down to three elements: the number of trips, the length of trips, and the mode that you're taking. And the mode that you're taking incorporates whether that's a high occupancy vehicle or an electric vehicle, or a vehicle of a differing fuel efficiency. So we can move the conversation on from we need to reduce our emissions by 50% to we need to change our mode share, or we need to shorten trip lengths, or we need to reduce the need to travel altogether. And each of those elements has a different impact on the total amount of carbon produced, which this dashboard provides something which, whether it's elected officials and decision makers, senior managers, or ultimately this will be for the general public, can see what the impact of those different changes will have, and how we can get this monumental shift in carbon emissions. But even if we get down to a level of we decided we're going to do this by increasing vehicle occupancy by 30%, reducing trip lengths by 20%, and so on. So, okay, what is it we need to do now? And this is where we need the robust transport modelling. We've got lots of evidence, both locally and overseas, of the effectiveness of different kinds of schemes, but we need to have good, solid evidence, defensible evidence around the cost of schemes, the effectiveness of them. So what is the impact on trip length, on trip numbers? We need to have confidence that investing is going to impact mode shift, or urban forms of certain kinds are going to impact trip length, so that we understand the risk of meeting our objectives or otherwise. And whilst this is very focused on our kind of drop dead targets for CO2 emissions, we also need to think about those broader impacts. And this is where things like electric vehicles come up quite a lot in discussion, that, yep, having 100% electric vehicle fleet may do wonders for our greenhouse gas emissions, but it does very little for all of the other negative consequences of private vehicle travel, whether that be congestion, crashes, urban form, amenity, etc. And we need all of this to be defensible and have a good underpinning evidence base, because ultimately, whatever decisions are made, they need to be publicly acceptable, because otherwise elected officials won't make decisions that are going to get them voted out in the next round of elections. So, always good to finish with the wise old man from the 20th century. With regards to helping make these decisions, we need that solid underpinning evidence base. because we need to make a fundamental change. And as Phil highlighted, it's unclear whether our models are set up for these paradigm shifts, because we really need to have confidence that when we're making these paradigm shifts, we don't need the answer to 10 decimal places for minor nudges along the way. We need to know roughly that we're getting things right if we make these big game-changing investment changes. Other things which transport models may be useful for is helping decision makers understand how we can get people to think more broadly about the external impacts of travel, and this is both positive and positive and negative, because the last few decades, particularly in New Zealand, where there's very few cities which have significant levels of congestion, we have this unfettered level of access to goods and opportunities that have been facilitated by the private vehicle. So we need to make a call on whether that level of access is sustainable by other modes, or whether we should be looking at how we can reduce that level of accessibility, but in a publicly acceptable way. And having good underpinning evidence from transport models and analysis is kind of fundamental to help with that discussion. And with that, I think I will leave you.
Thank you very much, Darren. Robin, if you would like to come online. And I have not seen any questions being asked, so please remember to post your questions on the right-hand side under Q&A in the conference room. I'm pretty sure both presentations so far should have jogged our memories a little bit, and there's a few questions there, I'm sure, so please put them down there. Robin, it's your next 20 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kerstin. So it's great to speak at Modeling World International. I'm going to talk about vehicle mission models and how they link to transport models. So first of all, a few words about vehicle mission modeling. So vehicle mission modeling is a complex exercise, and that's mainly because vehicle missions are highly variable in time and space. And you can see at the bottom just a selection of variables that will influence vehicle missions. As a consequence, vehicle mission models rely heavily on empirical data, which is basically vehicle mission measurements, and statistical methods to make sense of them. So you can see on the right, there's different ways of measuring vehicle missions, and I won't go into that, but there's laboratory testing, tunnel testing, onboard emissions testing, and on-the-road emissions testing. And this type of information is then fed into the development of vehicle mission models like Cobalt Australia and P-Delta-P, which I'm going to say a few words about. Getting back to the complexity, so implications for vehicle mission modelers. So when you look at the different colored cells here, the light blue cells are related to vehicle parameters. So we're talking about vehicle weight, vehicle size, aerodynamic drag, the fuel type, the emission control technology, etc., etc. And basically what this means is that we need a very detailed fleet classification to be able to accurately estimate emissions. When you look at the green cells, this basically shows that emissions are affected by vehicle operating conditions like vehicle speed, vehicle acceleration, road gradient, payload, as well as ambient conditions like temperature, humidity, and pressure. And then there's other variables which are shown in the dark blue cells. For example, the way the vehicle is maintained, technology failure, aging effects, fuel quality impacts. So you can see that this sort of information also needs to be accounted for in vehicle mission modeling. Now, the good news is, vehicle missions models are complicated, but the good news is that linking them to transport models is relatively easy. In fact, vehicle mission models are designed to take output from transport models. So for an emission model like myself, transport model output is basically regarded as a convenient, quality-checked, and comprehensive input database for traffic activity and traffic performance. So basically, a vehicle mission model is more or less a post-processor, providing another layer of fuel use and emissions information to answer subsequent policy questions. Again, I guess the important consideration, as it would be for transport models, is the scale and the resolution. So I'm going to show you two examples of that. The first is some work I did with my friends at Emission, where we used a microscopic traffic model and combined it with high-resolution vehicle emissions model. So this was done for the Adelaide CBD. It was a small network of 95 links, 2 peak hours, but the simulation generated a little less than 10,000 vehicle speed time traces. This information was then fed into a model called P delta P, which basically calculates engine power and the change in engine power, and then estimates the emissions subsequently. So this led to about 400,000 emission predictions at second-by-second intervals. And this information is highly detailed, obviously, and it can be used for hotspot analysis, congestion impact assessments, or the assessment of traffic measures like, would a roundabout be better than a traffic signal? What's the impact of coordinated signals in this network? However, there are also improvements possible, obviously. So first of one of them is adding road gradient or using elevation data to improve your estimates, and apply speed filters to output from microscopic models to make sure that it's not too noisy and more realistic accelerations are achieved. Another example is some work I did in the Netherlands, in this case using a macroscopic traffic model and a different emission model, which is widely used in Europe, called Copert. This is the Amsterdam road network. It has more links, slightly larger periods, and it used an average speed vehicle emission model. So in this case, the emission rates for a range of vehicle classes is dependent on the link speeds. And it will vary in a nonlinear fashion. Improvements are, instead of using a single link or a single road speed, using speed distributions, which is what we've done in this work, and of course using hourly resolution simulations, which gives you a higher granularity in the emission predictions. Again, the information can be used for hotspot analysis, scenario modeling, or estimation of total emission loads for the network, and assess different policy interventions. Now, one of the things I really wanted to emphasize today is the fleet mix. Fleet mix is a very important aspect for vehicle emission models because of the different variables that affect vehicle emissions, as I started this presentation with. I normally use a rule of thumb, which is basically saying that vehicle travel is most important, then the fleet mix, and then the driving conditions. And in this respect, there is a discrepancy between transport models and vehicle emission models. So to give you an example, transport models typically give me information for 2 to 3 vehicle classes. Could, for example, be light-duty vehicles or heavy-duty vehicles. Copert Australia, on the other hand, has a much more refined vehicle classification, and it has vehicle emission rates for 226 vehicle classes. So the solution is to use a fleet model to weigh and aggregate emission predictions. To give you an example, the Australian fleet model simulates the population and the travel for about over 1,000 vehicle classes, which are defined in terms of vehicle type, engine capacity, weight, fuel, and age. It considers for each base year vehicle population or the growth in vehicle population, vehicle sales, age-mileage relationships, and vehicle scrappage. And to give you an example, this is for a particular vehicle class, a small petrol passenger car. The simulations can be used to calculate VKT-based weighting factors. So you can see on the left, 2010, it will have a distribution of VKT over different emission control technology categories, and that will shift when you move in time to 2025. Now, this information can be used to basically aggregate up emission rates until to the point that they match the transport model output. And I just want to emphasize, and I think especially with electric vehicles, it is very important, is very dynamic consumer behavior. What you can see here is vehicle sales data. You can see this is over the period 1980-2015. Light commercial vehicles have steadily grown, but we see quite a shift in a move from SUVs, the larger passenger cars, to at the expense of smaller passenger cars. And since weight is a very important aspect of vehicle emissions, the heavier or the bigger the vehicle, the higher the CO2 emissions. This is quite significant. And before I move on, I just wanted to put in perspective the climate change challenge here. So globally, road transport uses about 3 trillion liters of fuel, fossil fuel per year. So that includes diesel, petrol, LPG, and CNG. And to visualize this, you can see on the right, this is one of the biggest swimming pools in the world. If you translate that into how many pools are actually used, it's 12,000 of these fossil fuel pools are burned each year, which is basically the same as one pool every 45 minutes. And it would be the same as 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools every minute. So the scale of the amount of fossil fuels we're only using for transport is massive. So the question really is, what can we do to reduce this to meet our climate challenges? And electric vehicles are widely discussed and also accepted as something that is a good solution forward. And I've recently done a national assessment for Australia. So importantly, in this case, transport models are not used. And what I've done here is a life cycle assessment. So life cycle assessment is a systematic method that considers and evaluates all the aspects of a vehicle's life and its associated impacts. It's also sometimes called cradle to grave. So we're looking at vehicle production, fossil fuel production, electricity production, vehicle operation, disposal, and recycling. And looking at all those different aspects is important because it can clarify the trade-offs between different environmental impacts or between different stages of the entire life cycle. So this work used different sources of data. So I've used the Corporate Australia model that I mentioned before to simulate the vehicle emissions at national level, using input from the Australian fleet model. There's different vehicle parameter data sets that were very useful. There is energy data and fuel statistics data from the federal government. Then there was a number of really useful meta-analysis studies, which are relevant to some extent that I actually was able to access the data from those authors. And then there's the review of scientific papers and reports. So one of the things I think we need to realize is that this statement here, that all models are wrong, but some are useful, and I think it's very true. And the reason he said this was that all the models are simplifications of reality. And I think it's very important, therefore, to assess the quality of the models, and the previous speakers have alluded to this as well. And I think in this case, providing another layer of information, which is basically the level of uncertainty, is very important in my view, especially now when there's can be large changes in the world that we need to account for. Now, getting back to LCA, life cycle impact assessment is particularly tricky because it's a very complicated thing to do. It can be very localized, and it's very dynamic in time. So in this case, it's particularly important that uncertainty is quantified. So what I've done in this case is probabilistic life cycle assessment, which is basically a statistical approach where you quantify the uncertainty in the inputs and then use statistical techniques to propagate that through to the end result. And I was interested to look at the fleet average emission rate in grams of CO2 equivalents per kilometer for the Australian passenger vehicle fleet. Going straight to the results, basically showed that electric vehicles will reduce life cycle greenhouse gas emission rates with about 30% for the current electricity mix used in Australia, which is still largely fossil fueled, with an uncertainty 95% confident interval of 16 to 40%. For a 100% fossil fueled scenario, 100% fossil fueled scenario, it would be about 15% with an uncertainty of 5 to 30%. And a more future renewable electricity scenario would be about 75% with an uncertainty of 70 to 80%. And that's where we want to get to. So the conclusion is that a rapid electrification of the Australian PV fleet is a robust way, which I think is important for us, looking at uncertainty, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from road transport. It will immediately provide significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions per kilometer traveled. And obviously, with slow penetration rates, we need to start as soon as possible with this. And then greenhouse gas emissions will continue to drop further as the electricity system is increasingly decarbonized. This also allows us to, this type of assessment allows us to look further into what is important. And it's interesting to see that the operational phase, which is basically driving on the road, is the most important factor or aspect for both electric vehicles and fossil fuel vehicles. It's about 70% for both of them, but battery electric vehicles are significantly more energy efficient, so they have lower emission rates. Vehicle production is important, but because in Australia vehicles are already quite large and heavy, they're only 25% higher in terms of their additional greenhouse gas emissions. And I just wanted to end with some closing comments and conclusions. So transport and vehicle emission models are natural partners. However, they do not match seamlessly at this stage and require fleet mix or fleet turnover models. They also require additional data. What I've shown is things like elevation and road gradient or information about meteorological conditions. So the question to me is, to what extent can and should these be integrated in transport models? Skill and resolution are important for both types of models, and transport models are not always necessary for emission impact assessment. The transport data itself is. So I gave an example of a national level assessment using life cycle analysis, but you can also use GPS or mobile phone app information about travel trajectories or the use of drive cycles. So the question for me is further guidance required regarding which combination of transport emission models should be used and when. And that's where I would like to leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. I will just ask the other presenters to join me and Robin as well for by the looks of it, very short Q&A session from the audience, but I'll have a couple of questions and maybe we'll have a good discussion anyway. So I'll start with the one question we got from the audience, which is from John Richardson, and he has a question for Darren, and that is, what sort of buy-in do you have from the councillors in Christchurch on climate change, and how transport modelling can be used to support an action plan?
So I think we have absolute buy-in around climate change, and I think that's, I guess, as a result of we're having to do lots of work with mitigation. So obviously our focus at the moment is around, our focus is about mitigation and mitigating the level of CO2 emissions, but there's a lot of adaptation work going because Christchurch is a very low-lying city. A huge part of the east of the city is got two rivers running through it, at risk of the effects of climate change. So absolutely have buy-in, but there's also recognition that there are trade-offs to be made, and it comes back to the some elements of New Zealand emissions on a global scale are quite a small component. But then, is it better to be one of the leaders to show how things could be done, should be done, or just leave it to everyone else and the larger emitters to do all the hard yards? But also an element of, if we're going to say this is going to reduce people's level of access or it's going to make it harder for them, we need to have a very solid evidence base to underpin that. And that's where, like, using the dashboard that we're developing, working with Waka Kotahi, Ministry of Transport nationally, and also other urban areas of New Zealand, other cities, so that we can get this consistent evidence base for how we understand the impacts of different types of intervention. Because I think it's happened, I've seen the work both in Auckland and Christchurch, that there's, for example, a perception that the public transport is going to save us. When you look at all of the analysis that underpins some of the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars worth of investment, that from a climate change perspective directly, the mode shift that it's resulting in isn't really moving the dial on emissions. It's moving in the right direction, but it's not the silver bullet. But then that's where it comes into this broader impacts. It's almost a necessary but not sufficient. So we have to do lots more. But I think many of our councillors now are getting to the realisation that we need to pull every lever we've got as hard as we can in order to help move this, some of which is in our control. And referred to Robin's work, a lot of that's national work as well with regards to national legislation. So, but then what is our role in actually investing versus what's our role in advocating for better outcomes nationally as well?
Thanks, Darren. And I might go quickly to Phil and ask a similar question for the UK. Is there any uptake through councillors there or through the government that sort of brings things along a bit quicker?
Well, I'd like to be able to say yes. We had a government statement yesterday, actually, with great promises about intensifying the pace of carbon reduction from transport. I mean, so recently that we haven't yet had a chance to sort of look at the detail. I think the problem has been the mismatch between generic policy objectives, something that we ought to be doing, and detailed levers. Darren's point about pulling every lever we can all at the same time as hard as we can. And that's been the bit that's been missing up to now. So, for example, at the same time, we've had ambitions to reduce car travel and a massive increase in the scale of road provision. And that doesn't really make sense because emissions are not only about vehicles at the point where they're in use. There is also the construction and scrappage of vehicles which take carbon. There's the provision of infrastructure. Concrete is one of the most carbon intensive materials that were in use. And that putting it all together, I think, has been something which I don't think anybody's got right yet. I certainly wouldn't claim that we have.
And then passing the buck on to Robin, probably. Do you have anything around Australian councillors' government?
Yeah, I think some of the states have developed some pretty ambitious plans to reduce CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. And I think they're in full development of those. But I fully agree that to enable fast and rapid reduction of CO2 emissions, you need a really integrated approach. You can't build roads on one hand and then, have targets on the other hand. There's lots of things that can be done. I was just thinking about things like mobility as a service. We have to change the way we will move ourselves around. Basically, you're shifting thinking how we can actually achieve this. What I do know, for example, is that there's some research that shows that people that drive electric vehicles have changed their behavior in terms of optimizing their energy use, because they actually have to keep an eye on that, they feel, and they will change their driving behavior because energy use becomes one of the things they consider in their driving, which I don't think is particularly the case for people that drive conventional vehicles. We can probably talk for hours about the possible ways to reduce emissions, but I think the main thing is integration to make sure that we're not failing in our targets.
Thank you, Robin. Darren, you had a question anyways.
Could I just add to that? Because with regards to thinking about not only integration of all of the different levers we've got to pull, but integration with all of the other outcomes we're trying to achieve. Because there's a master's student in Christchurch looking at the trip length and trip numbers of EV drivers and how those had changed, because you've almost got a kind of a guilt-free drive. So there's this inducing of traffic as a result of ways you might have previously combined a trip or walked to the shops. You can just nip down in your Nissan Leaf now, which is great from an emissions perspective, but with regards to congestion and crash risk and amenity for locals, there's that trade-off to be made as well. So I agree we need to integrate all of the different levers and how we pull them, but also think more broadly than just emissions, because whilst we have absolute targets, there's lots of other stuff around health and well-being and livability that our transport system has to deliver on as well.
Yeah, totally agree. Darren, while you're talking, do you want to ask your question to Robin that you posted?
But yeah, so this comes up quite a lot with regards to actually from our councillors as well. They see that smoothing traffic flow is to reduce emissions has kind of been a desired impact. So less stop-start, smoother traffic flow reduces our emissions. So that's what we should be doing. But then obviously we have on the flip side of that, that if you smooth traffic flow and make it easy for people to drive, then more people will drive. So how do we balance those trade-offs between reducing emissions by having smoother traffic flow, but not increasing emissions by having more people traveling?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. I think it's a good question. It's difficult for me to answer. Probably more operating into the field of the transport modeling, how you can manage your traffic flows and your traffic performance. But I agree that if you would reduce your congestion levels, then on a per vehicle basis, as long as the amount of travel remains the same, is going to be improved. But I think, again, we have to sort of think a bit wider in terms of possible solutions, different ways of traveling. Like I said before, mobility as a service potentially, but there's lots of other things that we probably can do. It really is, in my view, a transport engineering and transport planning question. So maybe Phil has got something to share about that.
Yeah, I've been worrying a bit about this, and also about the how we actually handle the conversion from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. I mean, experience has been that unless you intervene, traffic will grow to the point of unacceptability. And that's the sort of natural state of an unmanaged traffic and road system, is the amount of traffic is enough so that the volume of stop-start motoring is just about where people don't want to do it anymore. And it creates a real problem, because it means that attempts to get your desired free flow conditions make you attempt an unending process of expanding the road capacity to match the traffic, and you get a year or two's relief, and then it doesn't last. So all you end up with is more vehicles travelling in stop-start conditions, which clearly must be worse than your starting point. But what I was been wondering, and especially, I mean, I don't know how you handle this, Robin. It seems to me that the conversion of the entire vehicle fleet over time from fossil fuel to electricity is quite different from the nature of the progressive replacement of small vehicles by big vehicles, or big vehicles by small vehicles, or one design specification or another design specification. And that's this: if we're going to get the advantage of reducing carbon by the phasing out of fossil fuel vehicles, then they have to be scrapped. They actually have to be physically withdrawn from the market. The presumption is that vehicles have a much longer life in total than the time that they're owned by a particular owner, because it gets progressively cascading down to distant markets, poorer and poorer people, poorer and poorer countries. And so that, as it were, preserves the vehicle fleet while converting to electricity for the new vehicles. And that won't work. If we want to get a complete electrification, we actually have to stop short this progressive cascade of vehicles having longer and longer lives. And that surely must be hugely energy intensive. I mean, simply the business of taking all the existing fossil fuel vehicles and converting them into stockpiles of metal. If we were able to convert, that would be fine. If we could just take out the engine and replace them by electric engines, then that's an answer. Every time I raise this, the vehicle experts say, no, it's just not feasible. You can't do it. The vehicle design makes it incredibly inefficient if you're going to do that. And I wonder where this leaves life cycle analysis. If you're going to take the entire life cycle of a vehicle, including the energy and carbon involved in manufacturing it, then surely it's a different situation if you then have to stop that vehicle life abruptly to cut it short, than if you can assume that, well, somewhere else in the world these vehicles are going to go on being used. How do you actually handle that?
Yeah, I mean, it can always be modeled in a way. So what I've shown is that most of the carbon is actually emitted during the operational phase. So it was about 70% for the modeling I've done. So the vehicle production is significant, but it is compared to operational emissions, it's less important. So I guess there will be a sort of a sweet point where you get to benefits if you scrap your fossil fueled vehicles. But I agree with you, it's something that you would need to simulate. But I think more importantly, the purchasing behavior of people is important. So that's why I think that very detailed fleet breakdown, where you look at weight classes of electric vehicles versus fossil fuel vehicles, that will be an important factor. Because if you have a large SUV at the moment, a large diesel SUV, you replace it with a lighter electric vehicle, the CO2 emission rates per kilometer will even be less, in addition to the energy efficiency of electric vehicles. If it's the other way around, then the benefit will be less, again, in terms of CO2 emissions. So I think what we really need is a very detailed assessment with a sensitivity analysis to look at possible consumer behavior in terms of what electric vehicles are going to replace which fossil fueled vehicles. But again, that's a grams per kilometer assessment, is what I've done, and I acknowledge that the growth in travel is basically one of the main factors of the increase in transport emissions. I think almost everywhere in the world. So it's both factors. We need to reduce the grams of greenhouse gas emissions per kilometer, as well as reduce our VKT. But I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit still for the grams per kilometer, because, as you probably know, the vehicles have become larger and heavier on average everywhere in the world, and that's really not that's accelerating our CO2 emissions per kilometer. So you want to really reduce that, and I think lightweighting vehicles, including electric vehicles, and using the efficiency of energy electric vehicles will help at least that part. And then the VKT side of things, travel demand and how people travel, is the other big thing.
I can see the point about emissions during use being greater than the emissions in production, but what we're now talking about is a massive replacement of the entire vehicle fleet at a speed which is far greater than the normal sort of steady evolution of change. And intuitively, it seems to me the carbon cost of manufacture of an entirely new worldwide vehicle fleet in an accelerated time, because we haven't got much time in terms of the carbon emissions, that surely becomes a very material factor, doesn't it? Even if over the whole life it's a minority, to have this all now seems to be implying an enormous carbon burden rather than carbon saving.
Yeah, sorry, I may want to clarify that a bit better. I mean, what I've seen is that the carbon cost of the production of an electric vehicle really depends on where it's being manufactured. So in the US, they have set up systems that use recycling, and they use renewable energy to produce those vehicles. So the carbon footprint of vehicle production is very different and much lower than if you would do it in another country where that's not the case. So I think recycling of materials is really important anyway, because mining has also a significant footprint. But also the energy used to produce those vehicles or to reprocess those vehicles, as long as it's renewable, I think it's probably manageable. But all those things can be assessed, and there will be probably a sweet point, like I said, where you get to quick reduction in CO2 emissions with a certain scrappage rate. So, but in my view, the natural penetration of vehicles, especially in Australia, which has quite old vehicles in the fleet that they remain in the fleet for a long time, is really going to mean, if we maintain that we're never going to meet our climate change targets. Yes. So we do need to accelerate that penetration of electric vehicles to be able to meet it.
We actually did get through a couple more questions. So Darren, maybe I'll chuck this next one at you first. Do you think mobility management should be made, I would think that's compulsory at every workplace to achieve the emission goals?
Yes. I guess is the short answer. It's something we're already doing with, or I would imagine most cities around the world as well, around travel demand management. So absolutely fundamental. And again, this comes back to, we want people to have access to employment opportunities and helping them make decisions with a more holistic view of the impact of those decisions. So certainly the demand management programs that we have here, it's around helping people make informed choices, because very often people would like to make a more sustainable choice, but the trade-offs they're making is they can't drop their kids to school, or they can't get to sport, or they can't pick something up on the way home, or they can't go and get the fridge that they're buying every day. It's those kind of things which there are relatively simple solutions to. So you can achieve the emissions outcome, but from understanding and resolving other problems, which ultimately come down to having access to these opportunities and things that people want to do.
So
but in short, yes.
So follow-up question for me on this one. Do you think then the council is doing enough on educating people and giving mobility choices for people to access the work?
We could always do more. Again, this is in a financially constrained environment. My personal view is that more focus on demand management and less on supply provision would be a good thing. It's also way more cost effective, but that becomes a very difficult sell to the public, because you're essentially trying to ask them to do less, which then we're in a position where, I remember carbon calculators or environmental footprint they've been around for decades. I remember, and yeah, a long time ago doing one, and you think, crikey, my carbon footprint is way bigger than it should be, like orders of magnitude. But that's been facilitated and enabled by investment for decades. So it becomes very hard to make a morally appropriate decision when you're kind of being incentivized to do the opposite.
It's true. Right, there's a next question. And I'll put that to everyone because I'm not sure who wants to tackle it. I sometimes do not understand why we have to justify an investment in cycleways, footpaths, and bus lanes. Isn't that a right of the citizen?
Let me chip in on that. I mean, one of the really interesting developments in, let's call it the ethics or the philosophy of transport planning fairly recently is the idea, I I mean, everybody knows that equity is important and human rights are important, and everybody brings their own sort of meaning of that. But the interesting concept to me is, should there be a right to be able to live a reasonable sort of life without having to own a car? I mean, there are many people who wouldn't mind at all having doing with less car use or even no car at all, provided there are opportunities for just having a normal life without doing so. And what we've done is sort of constructed a dynamic where it becomes more and more difficult to live that normal life without a car. Recent case that's affected to us has been the provision of vaccination facilities, which are only available on a drive-through basis. And it gives you pause for thought, doesn't it? You're only allowed to be vaccinated if you're able to travel by car to the vaccination centre. It's appalling. So that's why I quite like the question, because it's putting it the other way round. If there are other opportunities for living a normal life because they're close to you and you don't need to have a vehicle, or because you can use a bike for those that want to. Typically, the experience seems to be that if there are good cycling facilities, a lot more people want to than if there are bad cycling facilities, and that makes sense. It does seem to me that the preoccupation of transport planners and therefore transport modelers with vehicle travel it does narrow the confines of what sort of solutions you're able to look at. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea, the French now are exploring this a bit, of the idea of the 15-minute city or the 10-minute city or whatever, that you can get most of your ordinary needs of life, the basic shopping, the access to schools, access to health facilities and so on, within a close enough distance to you that you're not forced to use a resource-intensive method like driving. And I think that's got a lot going for it, and it shifts the sort of nature of the debate a bit. It's not saying that we have to constrain people's liberties. It's saying that we look at liberty in a different way, that there is also there's a liberty of freedom from a car as well as freedom to have a car, and both of these need to be delivered.
That's true. Sorry, yeah, go
so
for
I'll
it.
just add to that, because it comes back to trade-offs as well, which I absolutely agree with what you're saying, Phil. But we're in Christchurch in particular, I guess most of New Zealand and a lot of rural areas of the UK where I grew up. It should not be possible, really, to have a quarter-acre section, 3-bedroomed, affordable house in a rural setting and be 20 minutes away from work. It's kind of if we come back to the 15-minute city argument, agree completely, but that means that people cannot expect to have large lifestyle properties. That's where townhouses, apartment living, in order to fit the number of people in to support those services, densities have to increase. So in some respects, we are going to be impacting people's liberties, but it's perhaps impacting their liberty to choose something which isn't sustainable. Because in a greater Christchurch setting, there's developments being proposed and district plans for our neighbours, 12, 15 dwellings per hectare, going in, like relatively or very low density, and then they're wanting public transport routes to go to them so that people aren't car dependent. So that's physically not possible to do. So you cannot have developments which are such low density and provide good level of access by public transport, because it's just too spread out. So it's this trade-off that we need to increase densities to support effective public transport, because I agree it's it seems a sensible right to be able to access all of your opportunities without having to have the sunk cost of buying a vehicle. But in some respects, that means you're going to have to make a choice to not live or choose to live in a place where you have to.
Yeah, just to add to that, I saw a really interesting statistic the other day about American cities, that many of them have an average of something like 6 or 10 parking spaces available in the city as a whole per car. You need that because you obviously need your car, your parking spaces for your car, or for 2 cars, or for 3 cars at the house. But they're no use to you unless you have, if you have a car-based transport system, unless you have a parking space available to you at all the destinations you want to go to. And when you add that up, it means that more land area is being devoted to cars than to people's living space. And then you think, what this discussion about density is rather different. In order to be able to provide that accessibility by car, you're having to provide, usually from social expenditure, parking spaces which are far in excess of what you need for the density of living, which is a perfectly reasonable. What I'm thinking is that if we get away from, especially in cities, designing movement around the car as the key core mode of transport, it may not need such a drastic loss of the density of living as we're imagining, because we're sort of building in that extra land take for the cars that really are not doing us any favour at all. And I think the idea of building land use planning of that sort into transport planning has been around for years, but it's lip service rather than actually doing it.
Thank you very much. I've been told I cannot run over time. So at this point in time, unfortunately, we can't finish all the questions that came in last minute. If there is the chance, maybe the speakers have a chance to quickly answer some of them if there is time. Thank you very much, Phil, Robin, and Darren, for your presentations and for the discussion afterwards. That's much appreciated and was very insightful. Thanks to the audience for participating and sending through your questions. Please go to the left-hand side on your screen and go to the exhibition rooms and go into the networking rooms. I did see one of the exhibitors even offering a 6-month free Paramix discovery license. So there's some really nice things in there. So please go and check this out. Thank you very much. And I'll pass it on to Darren to close it off. Ngā mihi nui.
Kua mutu a mātou mahi mo tēnei wā, manakatia mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, aio kia aorangi. So it's basically saying our work here is finished for the time being, lots more to do. So go well with your friends and your family.
Thank you all.